This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Stephen Martyn, an Ontario-based teacher and practitioner of sacred agriculture and what he terms wildculturing. He focuses on the traditional living skills of growing food, building and healing, and has a unique take on how we can live in tune with the earth. Stephen had me pondering how agriculture has been used to create culture historically, how we incorporate intentionality into horticulture, and he even had me rethinking my morning beverage.
You know, I've been on the road a long time, and for a long time I was seeking and gathering. I eventually came to a time where I felt like what was more important was doing and being and those things. So I've achieved a certain amount in my life, I suppose, landscaping companies and schools and various other ventures that I've started. But really the challenge, I think, for all of us is to come into a place of attentiveness where we're present to the moment and to the larger beings that are there.
You, I think, have got a very interesting take on growing, and I wanted to explore that today. So can you just maybe tell me a bit about whether you're involved in growing on a kind of domestic scale, or are you looking at the bigger picture in your work and in your thinking?
Well, I grow all my family's food, and I grow food for the school. So when folks come for these 5-day sessions, they're eating. The vast majority is off the land here. So yeah, that's kind of a big piece. But over the years, I worked a lot with different Indigenous agriculturalists, and I've studied Indigenous agriculture a lot and practiced it for the last 25 years. So the kind of agriculture I do, at a glance, a lot of it might look just like your family garden or just like anybody else's garden, but there's kind of some key differences in terms of just my approach. And I suppose to kind of sum it up, I honor the wild, which is at the heart of gardening. And, it's at the heart of what we are. And yet when it comes to our garden spaces, we have this terrible kind of tendency to be kind of fascists, basically. It's all ours and it's just the way it has to be and such and such. And of course, this has a long history, goes back to the Romans, because the Romans were the first to really, in a large scale, kind of enslave other people to do their agriculture. And so they were really the first ones who started creating monoculture. And then now, of course, our whole industry and pretty much all the agriculture that most people see is all monoculture. But for lack of a better term, that's factory farming. It's an industrial model. And again, it has some pretty dark roots. And so when we look at agriculture, and a lot of people think it's kind of, it says right in the old book, in our old books, in our biblical things, that it's somehow almost a punishment for our falling from grace. But nothing could be further from the truth. Agriculture was a divine gift to save humanity and to save the planet. Agriculture was a spell we were supposed to reenact to create a culture of caretakers.
So tell me about your school. Where are you based?
Yeah, we're in what's called the Upper Ottawa Valley. It's in Ontario, kind of the center of Canada-ish. It's quite a northern climate. We have about 6 months of really deep winter freeze, and then we have a tumultuous, brief summer, and everything has to be grown and produced for the whole year in those few warm months. Not so different from the UK, just colder and longer winter and maybe hotter summer, possibly.
And so in the school, you're teaching your theories and your practices, I presume?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been a herbalist for 40 years, and I've been a gardener for more than 40 years. And again, went through everything and tried everything. So biodynamic and permaculture, and like I've studied everything. I actually have a master's in traditional plant use. So I do kind of have a pretty good grasp of the history and what's going on. And I think all of that led me to this bigger understanding, which is about the cultivation of ourself, the cultivation of culture, and the cultivation of land is all supposed to be one and the same acts, the same spells, if you will. But we kind of have lost all these things. And so we just do everything in a kind of a survival, rudimentary, very physical way. But we don't realize that everything we're doing has all this other stuff attached to it. And in doing it, we're perpetuating it. So in the school, I start from the start. I start from the beginning of creation. And then I go through the whole history of humanity, which is 500,000 years. And then I go through the more recent history of how we kind of got led astray. And this is all to give people a bigger context, which helps a lot if you're trying to change your perception, because there's many, many, many things to pull us back into the rut of industrial thinking and industrial existence.
So is that what you refer to as wild culturing?
Wild culturing is a bit more specific, which has to do with working with what's already on the land, largely. So this term wild crafting, and that's come to mean when you go out in the wild and you harvest stuff. Well, I kind of felt like it had to be brought into a bigger context, because when I go out to the bush and harvest stuff, I'm also reculturing so that those same plants will thrive. So, and this was the very beginnings of agriculture, of course, and went on for tens of thousands of years before any kind of large scale agriculture happened. And it's a very natural extension of the harvesting. If you're harvesting something, you know its value. If you harvest it all out and you come back the next year, there won't be anything there, or the next year or whatever, if you keep on hitting the same spot. But then if you look around and you see some dried plants with some seeds still sticking out, you've already dug up the ground a bunch of roots or something to bend that plant over, to shake the seeds into the spot, to kind of kick them into the soil or work them into the soil a bit. It's just this very small extension, but it's caring. It's caring for the land. It's caring for that plant. When you do something like that, and then you come back the next year and there's more, not less. And I've done this with things like, say, burdock, for example. We all know burdock, and lots of people hate burdock, but of course, burdock is this incredible food, so much food value. And at one point, I owned a tea company, and we needed something like 50 pounds dried, which was a 200 pounds wet weight of the roots. And I did exactly this, there was just a few to start with. And then I'd look for burrs and I'd bend the plants over, kick them into the ground. After 20 years of doing that, by the time I left the tea company, those same patches were about 50 feet wide and could have kept four of us busy all day harvesting in the one spot. So this is a kind of example of just a little bit of care and attention in the right spot can generate so much fecundity.
You sent me a lot of stuff before the interview, and it's fascinating and a little bit mind-blowing. And the one bit that you sent me that really resonated, I suppose, and actually goes back to exactly what you've been describing there, was the fact that kind of indigenous cultures tend to harvest and also tread lightly in the space and have respect for the fact that they can't strip out too much at any one time, and that there's a lot to be gained by propagating and perpetuating whatever is already in situ. And then going on from that, you talk about how people that harvest food in indigenous ways tend to be more polytheistic, and or they have this attitude to religion, or whatever you want to call it, that incorporates lots of different entities. And when the people who farm in a more monoculture way tend to be monotheistic, how does that resonate in your work? And do you find that one approach obviously pays off more than the other?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, to kind of just roll it right back and just go really slow through a piece of that, indigenous means from the land. It literally means from inside the land. So people who have evolved in a particular area develop these very intimate connections, relationships, all the deities. So just so everyone can understand that, say the weather, the sun, the moon, all these beings, and then all the plant beings, they also have all these intimate connections with. And so for them, the existence is all based on those relationships. Some can be seen, some can't be seen, but all treated in the same manner, which is you're bowing down to the thing first because you know it provides you with your life and your medicine. You're not kind of rushing in and just taking the thing. And so when you start to think about this, and then those people are conquered, right? Which pretty much anyone listening to this and anyone out there, there's been rolling conquests, and your ancestors were conquered again and again by different people. And then they were moved off their land. We're still doing it by people. The World Bank calls it transmigration. But as soon as you move people off the land, it breaks their connection with all those local deities, right? And then what's provided to the new slaves is a single patriarchal deity that isn't connected to the land, any specific place in any way. And so it fills that spiritual hollow, that gap. And so we rush towards that. But then, as I think Marx was very clear about religion, it is a drug in itself. It is something that can tranquilize people. And, well, we can be led in scary directions through this kind of monocultural type of thinking.
So, is there an argument then to be made for kind of staying put? I'm just thinking, we nowadays we're fairly relatively nomadic. We can move around with ease. We can leave one landscape and take root in another one. And I suppose with that, sometimes local knowledge is lost. Do you think that we should find a home and stay there for longer than maybe we do sometimes?
I absolutely do. And I get the temptation of greener pastures. There's always a place that looks like it might be better, and you can always question where you are. You can always question the relationships you're in because none of it's perfect, but it never will be, right? It's not necessarily the fault of the place, but it's the fault of our perception, and it follows us around. And I think what's driving folks to keep moving and keep selling and keep doing this thing is this ungroundedness, this lack of connection, this essentially a feeling like you're lost. And we are lost. And so the fact that we keep drifting around, for maybe greener pastures, it's understandable. But I think just like within yourself, you can't just strive for more and more. Become an astrophysicist, become a herbalist, become a triathlon, all these things to become a better person. But really, what's needed is to just stop and do the internal work. And so this is the same kind of equivalent I feel like we need to do on a larger scale, is just stop with all the moving around and rushing around and do the internal work. But the rushing is created by spells of our culture that keep people off balance and that keep them rushing. And it starts every day with this communion with this drug that we almost everybody takes first thing every morning. maybe not in the UK, but certainly in the Americas, coffee is this absolutely huge thing. And what it does is it's a spell. It's not just a beverage. When we drink coffee, we're taking a communion with this kind of overcharged, speedy culture so that we can step into it. And people are like, oh, if I don't have my coffee, I can't function. But really, maybe that's the way we're supposed to start the day. It's just like slowly as the sun's coming up slowly, we're coming around slowly, have some herbal tea made with some herbs in your backyard or something of the like, and what a different way to start the day and create a different spell so that we're not always running headlong after things, but rather turning it around and just trying to be present with ourself and with the energies. And then what happens for me, like I make no plans every day and I don't drink coffee in the morning, is when I'm sitting doing my meditation, all these things come to me in a gentle way. And they're things that I have to do that day. And so I kind of put them aside, finish my meditation, and then I start in. But I don't actually know what I'm going to do every day. So there's nothing to rush to. I'm just trying to be present so I can actually feel what needs to be done. But what an incredible privilege. I mean, this is only because I'm a polyculture and a polytheistic gardener and I've worked on it for 40 years, creating this life that I have, so it is an extreme privilege to be able to do that, but it's also the most natural thing in the world that most of us just, our lives are not set up to do that.
No, they're definitely not. I mean, when you were speaking about sort of moving, it reminded me of something I read the other day, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it said, going is hard, and you need to choose your hard. There aren't any sort of simple solutions, and wherever you end up, there's going to be problems. And so you have to stop looking for the next best thing sometimes. Again, you were saying about the spells of drinking coffee, and when you are engaging in agriculture, I think you feel that you're acting out ritual spells, and it's not just about growing the food and the kind of end result of that, but it's also about growing culture. So I wondered if you could talk about how agriculture ties in with culture as well.
Yeah. Well, again, if you think about the very kind of foundation of what's involved in agriculture, it's very powerful stuff. I mean, for example, the very first thing that's involved, people would say planting a seed. You got to plant a seed first. No, that's not the first thing. The first thing is the act of sacrifice. So something that's there has to go. Nature abhors a vacuum. Any place that's fertile, there will already be stuff growing wherever you want to grow things, unless it's a floodplain or something. But generally speaking, that's always the case. So the sacrifice is the first thing. And then the second thing is you're penetrating the earth, you're penetrating the mother, and then you're putting your seed into her. I'm sure this is all sounding very familiar. It's very profound stuff. And then it's an act of faith at that point. Because in fact, the viability of that seed, like say it's corn or something, the food value of it is lost as soon as you put it in the ground. So this is an act of faith. And then you're waiting. And just that whole waiting for the spirits, the spirit of the earth, the spirit of the seed, the thunder beings, the rain, you're waiting for everyone to get together and create this thing, which is the sprout, at which point the plant is born again and it grows up to regenerate itself plus 1,000 others, kind of thing. Now, if we think of this in terms of ourself, there's so many ripe metaphors here. So often we can't just go up in life. Everyone wants to just go up into the light. It's a big part of Christianity, and then it got carried on into the New Age tradition, up into the light. But that isn't how it works. In all the ancient traditions, it was always down You go down first, you go down into the earth, you go down into a cave, you go down into the well. And then it's only through that ancestral aquifer that's in the ground that we're brought back up as a spring. We're sprouted back up as a plant. So I can go like this for quite a while, but just to give you an idea of the depth of this ritual, and if we can consciously be doing it, it's co-creating with the goddess of the earth directly. We're dancing with the divine when we're doing agriculture. It's just been stripped of all its spiritual significance, so we forget about it. Everybody still loves it for all sorts of reasons, right? But I think part of the reason is that all of this stuff is underlying it still. We've just forgotten.
So, how do we remember? Obviously, it's a huge question, and I don't expect you to answer it, but could you perhaps give an example of how we do it wrong? What can we be doing better? What do we need to do to get that connection back?
Yeah, absolutely. I love to talk about it. I mean, that is kind of one of the main things I do in the school is, okay, so you're planting a seed or you're digging a garden or something like that. But then let's bring the ritual component, bring this conscious, for lack of a better word, symbolic act back into focus by really fully realizing what we're doing when we're doing it. And so, whether it's planting, like I was just speaking about, or whether you're going out and harvesting a plant, we don't go out and just harvest a plant. These plants are out in the wild, they have their own community. They're not expecting you to come along and pluck one of them out or whatever. So much like in the case of eloping with somebody, you have to court the parents, you have to court the grandparents of the plant, which is you give them praise and you give them prayer and you give them some offerings. And then they give you permission to take their daughter, to take their son. So again, everything I'm doing looks just like what any other herbalist or any other gardener is doing. But there's whole other components to it. I mean, these days, for example, I'm weeding a lot. Now, people go into their garden and weed with this kind of, again, this kind of fascist, almost hatred towards the weeds. I don't have that at all. It could not be more different. For me, they're all sacred volunteers in my garden, and I assess with every plant whether it's going to come out or not. And very often, gardeners are pulling plants out of their garden, like lamb's quarters or amaranth or things like that. It's more nutritious than anything they're growing. So, first, you have to know all those plants. Every plant, you have to know all its uses. These are the things I teach in the school. Then, with that much knowledge, you make an assessment whether that plant needs to be sacrificed for the crops that you're growing or whether it can be left. If it does need to be sacrificed, I put it on what's called an altar to death and decay. So I'm feeding those underground deities that give us the life. Now, a lot of people might just call that a compost pile. But for me, it's an altar of death and decay. You see what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost like we're gardening on autopilot or with kind of blinkers on. We know what we're doing. We feel that we should be doing it, but we're not doing it with any level of consciousness or overview of the importance of our actions. How confident are you that we will realise that we need to garden on a more deeper spiritual and intellectual level, I suppose, for want of a better word? Do you see that changing?
Well, I think, again, these things grow and they grow in accordance to the environment, So let's say I'm planting this seed right now, and then your listeners hear it or you hear it. And then depending on your life and how much space and how much presence you have, next time you're out in the garden or the next time you're even out picking berries in the bush or doing anything like that, maybe this seed will start to sprout. And you'll take that extra little moment just to have a little moment of prayer or thankfulness or whatever. And that's where it starts. And you're literally bringing the pieces back together, remembering this thing. And like anything, it starts off very small and you think, oh, this is just a small thing. But then the more you do it, it opens up. So then it becomes a bigger and bigger thing.
I could probably talk to you for about, well, a lifetime, quite probably. But obviously, we've only got a finite amount of time here. But is there anything else that you wanted to add that you feel is important?
Well, I think I would be remiss not to say that these are very, very difficult times we're in right now, and that there is a larger social collapse happening. And so it's a hard place to be for all of us, and I think we'd rather just ignore it and bumble on with our daily lives. But in a sense, the COVID thing and that whole fiasco, it's been a catalyst in a big way, and it's changed our culture in lots of ways. So we're on the rebound from this trauma, culturally speaking. And like when we're personally on a rebound from trauma, there's great opportunity to change, right? If you've gone through something, you don't want to just go back to the same thing. And so the health crisis that we're facing, the social crisis, the economic crisis, all of these things are just like when you start going down in your personal life, emotional stuff, physical stuff, spiritual stuff. And we continue to ignore the obvious until very often we get really sick. With most of us, we almost have to feel like we're going to die before we change, which is the sad truth. But it's going to be the same for our culture. The question is, how far down do we have to go, before we can have these seeds take hold and recreate culture? Because you got to say that culture's kind of been shattered. It's like a shipwreck now. And we're going along the beach and we're kind of combing for little pieces of it to try to put the thing back together. But really, we need to start from the ground. Culture comes from the ground, and knowledge comes from the ground. And we can't kind of trust much as what has come before, And so just to say, if you're feeling rough these days, good, you should be. If you're feeling anxious, good, you should be. It'd be weird if you didn't, actually. You might be more unhealthy if you weren't feeling some of that stuff. There's a lot going on. And yes, there's always been a lot going on, but there was something big, equivalent to a world war, equivalent to something that affects just about everybody on the planet. And so we're still in recovery from that. And so think about it, about being in recovery and not protecting yourself like when you haven't worked through a trauma, but carefully opening up to the world again. So that means other people and the earth and animals and plants.
Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Where can people find out more about you?
Our website is thesacredgardener.ca. I think we might be .com too, but it's The Sacred Gardener, all one word. That has the school pretty well described and the workshops that we're offering listed. There's lots and lots of listening material you can access, and there's some shorter online courses as well. And I know it's a ways to come, but we've definitely had people from Scotland, from the UK, from Sweden, from many places over the pond come to the school. So if you have the means and, you feel drawn, it's a pretty unique experience, and I can pretty much guarantee it will change your life.
Thank you very much to Stephen for a thought-provoking and unique interview, and thanks to you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 296, Regenerative Design with Eric Olson, and episode 250, The Human Garden with Tobacco Brown. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.